failure, divorced, Barren. Those 3 words burned across a massive projection screen at my cousin's wedding reception while nearly 200 guests stared up at them. Some laughed. Some looked away. My uncle lifted his champagne glass and said with a casual grin, "Relax, it's just a joke." My aunt swirled the ice in her drink as if she were watching a stage performance instead of her daughter being humiliated. And the bride, my cousin Lila, leaned into the microphone and added, "Careful. If you laugh too loud, Ava might actually start crying." I didn't cry. Instead, I reached under the table, unlocked my phone, and sent a single word in a text message. The room went quiet enough that I could hear a cube of ice crack inside my aunt's glass. What happened after that didn't just ruin the reception. It tore apart 16 years of carefully polished lies and the reputation my family had spent decades building in our town. But to understand why I pressed send on that message, you have to go back a few weeks. Back to the night a nurse called me from a number I didn't recognize. It was nearly 11 on a Thursday night when my phone lit up on my desk. I was still at the architecture firm where I worked in Charleston, finishing elevation sketches for a courthouse restoration project. My coffee had gone cold an hour earlier and my shoulders ached from leaning over the drafting table. The number on the screen showed a South Carolina area code, but not one from the city. Something smaller. Somewhere closer to where I grew up. I answered. "Hello." A calm, professional voice replied. "Is this Ava Carter?" "Yes. My name is Elena Ruiz. I'm a nurse at Blue Ridge Care Center. Your grandmother asked me to call you." My hand tightened around the phone. Grandma June was 84 years old and the only person in my family who had ever made me feel like I truly belonged in it. The nurse continued. "She's scheduled for hip replacement surgery in 3 weeks. Her condition is stable, but at her age there are always risks. She's been asking about you." I closed my eyes. It had been 2 years since I'd seen her. Not because I didn't want to. Because my family had made sure I couldn't. 2 years earlier I'd slipped into the nursing home on a quiet weekday afternoon when I knew my uncle wouldn't be there. We had spent 40 minutes together talking about her roses and the birds outside her window. The next day the front desk received a new instruction. Ava Carter was not allowed to visit unless approved by family. The nurse on the phone hesitated before continuing. "There's something else she wanted me to tell you." I waited. "Your uncle told her you're allowed to visit again, but only if you attend your cousin's wedding first." "Of course. Everything with Daniel Carter came with conditions." "And your grandmother said one more thing," the nurse added softly. "She said they're planning something at the reception. Something about you. She wanted you to be ready." I looked across my office at the framed certificate hanging on the wall. Emerging Architect of the Year, South Carolina. 5 years of silence from my hometown. And the first message that reached me wasn't from my parents or my cousins. It came from a nurse. To explain the rest, I have to go back even further. 16 years earlier. I was 18 years old and sitting at the kitchen table in my family's house in Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge is the kind of town where everyone knows your last name and exactly how much money your family makes. My Uncle Daniel slid a document across the table toward me. A land transfer form. The property in question was 2 acres on the edge of town. Rolling grass. A narrow creek. One old oak tree that had probably been there 100 years. My grandmother had given that land to me on my 16th birthday. She'd signed the paperwork herself and told me something I never forgot. "This is yours, Ava. No matter what happens." My uncle tapped the document. "I need this parcel for a development project," he said. "Sign it over." I looked at my mother. She sat at the end of the table flipping through a magazine like the conversation had nothing to do with her. Page after page turned while the room stayed silent. I didn't sign. 3 days later my uncle canceled my college tuition fund. The savings account that had supposedly been set aside for my education since I was born disappeared overnight. A week after that he stood in the foyer with his arms crossed and delivered the final message. "If you walk out that door tonight," he said, "don't bother coming back." My younger cousin Lila stood halfway up the staircase watching the whole scene. She didn't say a word. Neither did anyone else. I left with 1 duffel bag and $42 in my checking account. That same night Daniel Carter told the neighbors I had run off with a boyfriend and dropped out of school. None of it was true. But in Oak Ridge his version of events was the only one people heard. The next 2 weeks I slept in my car outside Greenville. During the day I worked the counter at a gas station just off the highway. At 19 I earned my GD. I waited tables at a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and fryer oil while taking community college classes in the evenings. 2 years later I transferred to the state university on a scholarship. I chose architecture because I liked the idea of creating structures that couldn't be erased by someone else's signature. Buildings stood where you put them. They didn't disappear because someone powerful decided they should. I graduated at 23. No one from my family attended. I shook the dean's hand on stage, smiled for the camera, and went home to a tiny apartment where I ate takeout noodles sitting on the floor. At 24 I married a man named Ryan Caldwell. He was older, charming in public and controlling in private. Over time I realized he managed my life the same way my uncle had tried to. Bank accounts, phone calls, friendships. I left that marriage 3 years later. At 28 a doctor told me something else. I wouldn't be able to have children. I sat alone in the clinic waiting room staring at a stack of outdated magazines while trying to process what that meant. Eventually someone in my family heard about it. My ex-husband had never been very good at keeping secrets. Now I'm 34. I'm a senior architect at Holloway and Price in Charleston. I specialize in restoring historic buildings, courthouses, libraries, theaters. Places meant to last. My professional name is Ava Caldwell Carter. The industry already recognized that name when I rebuilt my career, so I kept it. Not for sentiment. For practicality. No one in Oak Ridge knows anything about my life now. Not my job. Not my home. Not the awards. I didn't hide it to make a point. I simply stopped performing for people who had already decided who I was. The morning after the nurse called, I sat in my office staring at the skyline through the glass wall. Across the room my colleague Marcus Bennett worked quietly at his desk running structural simulations for a museum project. Marcus is 36, former Army communications specialist, and the calmest person I've ever met. He's also the closest thing I have to family. I knocked on the glass. "I need your help," I said. He listened while I explained everything. The wedding. The warning about the slideshow. The condition attached to visiting my grandmother. When I finished he leaned back in his chair. "If you go," he said, "you go with a plan." "I know. And you're definitely going." "My grandmother might not survive surgery," I said quietly. He nodded once. "Then we make sure you're not walking into that room blind." That night I booked a hotel in Oak Ridge for the wedding weekend. Then I pulled a navy dress from the back of my closet. Simple. Professional. Definitely not the kind of outfit my aunt would choose for me. Marcus had said go with a plan. So I started building one. And for the first time in 16 years I was grateful my family still believed I was the same powerless girl who left town with $40 in a duffel bag. Because they had no idea who I had become. 3 weeks before the wedding, my uncle required what he called a family dinner. His condition for adding my name back to the visitor list at Blue Ridge Care Center. So on a rainy Friday evening I drove 2 hours north toward Oak Ridge. The town looked almost identical to how I remembered it. White churches. 2 traffic lights. Manicured lawns arranged like advertisements for quiet success. My uncle's house stood on the corner lot at the edge of Pine Hill Drive. A large colonial with white pillars and a flagpole planted beside the driveway. Everything about it was meant to communicate stability, respectability, power. No one hugged me when I walked through the door. My aunt, Margaret Carter, looked me over the same way someone inspects produce in a grocery store. "You look thin," she said. "I'm fine." She didn't respond. Instead she turned and walked toward the dining room as if I were expected to follow. My Uncle Daniel sat at the head of the table. Same chair. Same posture. Same calm authority that had once terrified me. "So," he said folding his hands, "what exactly do you do these days?" "I'm an architect." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Answering phones for someone who actually designs things?" I picked up my fork and didn't correct him. Lila arrived 10 minutes later. She entered the room like a small celebrity, engagement ring flashing under the chandelier lights. For carats at least. She leaned over and hugged my aunt before sliding into her chair. Then she turned toward me. "Oh wow," she said lightly. "You actually came." I gave a small nod. Later that evening she cornered me in the hallway outside the kitchen. "I need a favor," she said. "What kind?" "At the wedding try not to draw attention to yourself." She gestured vaguely at my dress. Garrett's family is very traditional. Garrett Whitaker. The last name hit a small bell somewhere in my mind. You're still single, right? She added. Yes. She smiled politely. Some people just aren't meant for marriage. When I left that night, my aunt handed me a garment bag. Wear this to the wedding, she said. Inside was a beige dress 2 sizes too large. At the door, my uncle placed a firm hand on my shoulder. The Whitakers are very influential, he said quietly. Don't embarrass us. Halfway down the highway on the drive back to Charleston, the name finally clicked. Whitaker. I had seen it before. Monday morning I opened our firm's client database and typed the name into the search bar. Whitaker Heritage Foundation. And there was. Our firm had been hired 6 months earlier to design the restoration of an abandoned textile mill in Oak Ridge. The foundation's chairperson was listed as Eleanor Whitaker, Garrett Whitaker's mother. I stared at the screen for a long time. Eleanor Whitaker knew me professionally, but only by my work name, Ava Caldwell. We had exchanged dozens of emails, several video meetings, but we had never met in person. I leaned back in my chair, twisting. I had no intention of using that connection, but it meant one important thing. If everything collapsed in Oak Ridge, I wasn't entirely alone in that room. That evening Marcus called. I have something, he said. What kind of something? The reception venue hired a local AV company for the slideshow and microphones. Okay. They're short a technician. I understood immediately. You applied. Already hired, he replied. I exhaled slowly. Marcus. You're walking into a room where your family already loaded a weapon, he said calmly. I'm just making sure you have access to the safety switch. That week I built a presentation. Nothing aggressive. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Slide 1 showed a photo of me on graduation day. No family members beside me. Caption. No one came to my graduation. I went anyway. Slide 2 showed my architecture license. Slide 3 showed me at a construction site wearing a hard hat beside the courthouse renovation in Charleston. Slide 4 displayed the plaque for the Emerging Architect Award. Marcus scrolled through the slides on my laptop. Clean, he said. No insults. That's the point. He nodded. What's the trigger? I showed him the text message draft on my phone. 1 word. Begin. When you send that, he said, I switch the projector input. And if their slideshow turns out harmless? Then I never touch the system. 1 week before the wedding, my uncle allowed a supervised visit with my grandmother. Blue Ridge Care Center smelled like disinfectant and boiled vegetables. My aunt waited in the hallway while I entered the room. Grandma June looked smaller than I remembered, but her eyes were still sharp. She squeezed my hand tightly. You came. Of course. She reached under her pillow and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a photocopy of the land deed. My name was still listed as the owner. Your uncle never got it, she whispered. He told everyone he did. He tried, she said. You refused. For 16 years I had assumed he eventually found a way around my decision. He hadn't. The land was still legally mine. 5 days before the wedding, Lila added me to a family group chat. She posted a preview of the reception slideshow. I watched the images load. Old pictures of me edited with cartoon graphics. Then the captions. Dropout. Divorced. Broke. Alone. Finally. Barren. Lila followed the preview with a message. This is going to be hilarious. My aunt replied. Keep it tasteful. Not take it down. Not this is wrong. Just tasteful. I took screenshots and sent them to Marcus. Then I added 1 more slide to my presentation. A simple quote. The measure of a family is not how they celebrate their best, but how they treat their most vulnerable. The church was full. 200 guests at least. I sat in the last row. No one greeted me. No one moved to make space. The ceremony itself was ordinary. Smiles. Vows. Applause. Marcus stood near the side entrance wearing the AV company's black polo. Our eyes met briefly. He gave the smallest nod. The reception took place at Oak Ridge Country Club. Crystal chandeliers. White tablecloths. Soft piano music. Table 14 sat near the kitchen door. Every time it opened, the sound of clattering dishes spilled into the room. Lila delivered the first toast. She thanked the Whitaker family. Her bridesmaids. Her parents. Then she glanced toward the back. And my cousin Ava, who actually showed up today. Scattered laughter followed. I smiled politely. In 20 minutes the slideshow would begin. My phone rested in my lap. The message ready. The lights dimmed. The screen flickered on. Baby pictures of Lila appeared first. Birthday parties. School dances. Family vacations. I wasn't in any of them. Then the music changed. A drumroll sound effect played. The title appeared. Let's meet the rest of the family. My phone was already in my hand. I gave them one last chance. The first slide appeared. My high school photo. Caption. Dropout. Laughter rippled through the room. Next slide. Divorced. Next. Broke. Alone. Finally. Barren. Lila leaned into the microphone. Careful. She might cry. My uncle lifted his glass. Just a joke. Across the room Eleanor Whitaker stopped smiling. That was enough. I pressed send. 3 seconds later the slideshow froze. The screen went black. Then new text appeared. The real Ava Carter. The room fell silent. First slide. My graduation photo. Caption. No one came. I went anyway. Second slide. My architecture license. Third slide. Construction site photos. Fourth slide. The award plaque. Murmurs spread across the room. I stood from table 14 but didn't walk to the stage. My uncle hurried toward me. Turn that off, he hissed. Marcus didn't move. The system was locked. The final slide appeared. The measure of a family is not how they celebrate their best, but how they treat their most vulnerable. Then Eleanor Whitaker stood. She walked across the room and stopped beside me. You're Ava Caldwell, she said. Yes. She turned toward my uncle. The woman you just humiliated is the architect restoring the mill our foundation funded. The color drained from his face. Guests began whispering. Phones appeared. Lila tried to cry her way back into sympathy. But Eleanor calmly read the words from the original slideshow. Which part was the joke? She asked. The room settled like a jury reaching a verdict. When my uncle tried to salvage his business deal, Eleanor simply shook her head. After what I witnessed tonight, she said, there will be no partnership. Weeks later the town began talking. My aunt quietly lost several social committee positions. My uncle lost 2 development partners. Lila's marriage nearly collapsed before it began. I returned to Charleston and went back to work. The textile mill restoration moved forward. Grandma June recovered from surgery. And for the first time in years I visited her whenever I wanted. One morning months later I stood in front of the mirror holding a presentation invitation. The Oak Ridge Town Council wanted to review the restoration plans. My name appeared at the top. Ava Carter. Senior Architect. No hyphenated last names. No borrowed identities. Just mine. 6 months earlier I had sat at the back of a church while my family laughed at me. Now I was driving back to town for an entirely different reason. Not to beg for a seat at their table. But to build something new. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do in a room that once tried to erase you is simply stand up and begin. The parking lot outside Oak Ridge Country Club was half empty when I stepped outside. October air hit my face, cool, clean, and quiet. Inside the building, muffled voices echoed through the doors. Arguments. Confusion. The unraveling of a carefully arranged evening. I walked across the lot slowly, heels clicking against the pavement. For 16 years I had imagined confronting my family. In every version of the fantasy I had shouted. Demanded apologies. But now that it had actually happened, none of that seemed necessary. Truth had done the work for me. A car door slammed somewhere behind me. Hey. Marcus jogged toward me across the parking lot carrying 2 paper cups. He handed one to me. Gas station coffee, he said. The only thing open this late. I wrapped my hands around the cup. Perfect. For a moment neither of us spoke. Through the club windows we could see silhouettes moving back and forth. A group of guests exited the front doors, talking quietly as they walked to their cars. No one looked amused. Any regrets? Marcus asked. I considered the question. No. He nodded once. Good. My phone buzzed in my purse. Then again. And again. 3 messages. The first was from Garrett Whitaker. I'm sorry for what happened tonight. We need to talk. The second was from Elena, the nurse at Blue Ridge Care Center. Your grandmother saw the reception live stream. She's very proud of you. I smiled despite myself. The third message came from an unknown number. When I opened it, I saw Eleanor Whitaker's name. Monday morning. My office. We have a project to finish. I typed a quick reply. I'll be there. Marcus leaned against the car beside me. So, he said, what now? I looked back at the glowing windows of the country club. Now, I said, I go back to my hotel and sleep for about 12 hours. He laughed. Fair plan. Oak Ridge is the kind of town where news travels faster than storms. By Monday morning, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. Marcus monitored the situation like a data analyst. He had a talent for quietly observing things without getting emotionally involved. At lunchtime, he slid his phone across the table to me. A screenshot from the Oak Ridge Community Facebook group. Someone had posted a blurry photo of the slideshow screen. Caption read, "Did anyone else see what the Carters did to their own family member at the Whitaker wedding?" Below it were dozens of comments. Some angry. Some shocked. Some simply curious. That escalated quickly, Marcus said. I pushed the phone back. I didn't post anything. I know. He closed the screen. Sometimes truth spreads on its own. Eleanor Whitaker's office overlooked the Charleston harbor. Large windows. Minimal decor. Every object in the room seemed chosen for function rather than display. She greeted me with a firm handshake. I'm glad you came. Of course. She gestured toward a chair. I reviewed the final restoration plans this weekend. And she smiled slightly. And they're excellent. Relief spread through my chest. The project had taken nearly a year of work. Then her expression grew thoughtful. I also reviewed the video someone sent me from the reception. I nodded slowly. I'm sorry you had to witness that. She shook her head. No, I'm grateful I did. I blinked. Why? Because it showed me exactly the kind of person I hired. She leaned back in her chair. Someone who refuses to disappear when treated unfairly. The meeting lasted another hour. We discussed construction timelines, budget approvals, material sourcing. When it ended, she walked me to the door. One more thing, she said. Yes. The Oak Ridge Council presentation is scheduled in 3 months. I know. I'd like you to lead it. While my life in Charleston returned to its usual rhythm, Oak Ridge continued rearranging itself. The town didn't collapse around my family. But the subtle shifts were impossible to ignore. My Aunt Margaret quietly lost her position on the Autumn Festival Committee. No official explanation. Just a polite email thanking her for past service. My Uncle Daniel's development company lost 2 minor investors. Not catastrophic, but noticeable. In towns like Oak Ridge, reputation functions like currency. And once that currency starts losing value, people pay attention. Marcus read updates to me occasionally. Not because I asked, but because he understood closure matters. Your cousin's husband moved into the guest house at his parents' place, he said one afternoon. That was fast. Apparently they're considering counseling. I stirred my coffee. I hope it helps. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You're remarkably calm about all of this. Anger gets exhausting after 16 years. 3 weeks after the wedding, my phone rang late one evening. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in years. Daniel Carter. I considered ignoring it. Then curiosity won. Hello. He skipped any greeting. The land, he said. Name your price. I leaned back in my chair. It's not for sale. You're being unreasonable. It was a gift from Grandma June. You're destroying this family over 2 acres of dirt. No, I said quietly. You destroyed this family 16 years ago when you chose 2 acres of dirt over your niece. Silence filled the line. Long. Heavy. Finally he spoke again. You always were stubborn. I learned from watching you. Another pause. Then he hung up. The next unexpected call came on a Sunday morning. Lila. Her voice sounded different. Quieter. I wanted to say something, she said. I waited. The slideshow was wrong. Yes, I said. I know that now. She exhaled shakily. I've been thinking about it a lot. Another pause. I don't think I realized how cruel it was. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was angry. Because honesty deserved careful handling. Cruelty becomes normal if you grow up around it, I said finally. Yeah, she whispered. Garrett had apparently insisted on counseling if their marriage was going to survive. For the first time in her life, someone had challenged the narrative she'd been raised with. I don't know who I am without being the favorite, she admitted. That's something you'll have to figure out. Silence stretched between us. Do you think we could ever start over? She asked. I don't know, I said truthfully. But maybe. A week later I drove north again. Not to attend a family event. Not to negotiate conditions. Just to visit my grandmother. Blue Ridge Care Center looked the same as always. But this time no one stopped me at the desk. Elena greeted me with a smile. She's been waiting. Grandma June sat beside a large window in the sunroom. A crocheted blanket draped over her lap. When she saw me, her entire face lit up. You stood up, she said immediately. Yes. He squeezed my hand. I knew you would. For the next hour we talked about everything I had never been able to share before. College. Work. The courthouse renovation. The textile mill project. She listened with quiet pride. No one can take your life away from you now, she said. I know. 6 months passed quickly. Construction began on the textile mill restoration. Brick by brick the abandoned structure transformed into something new. The Oak Ridge Town Council presentation approached. On the morning of the meeting I stood in front of my bedroom mirror adjusting my navy blazer. On the dresser lay the printed invitation. Ava Carter Senior Architect. No hyphenated names. No borrowed identity. Just mine. Marcus drove with me to Oak Ridge. The mountains appeared blue against the horizon as we approached the town. You ready? He asked. Yes. Good, he said. Because this is going to be fun. The council meeting took place in the old municipal hall. Many of the same people who had attended the wedding sat in the audience. But the atmosphere felt different now. Curious. Respectful. When my name was called, I stepped to the front of the room. Slides illuminated the screen behind me. Not humiliations. Not jokes. Architectural plans. Historical preservation designs. A vision for turning the abandoned mill into a community arts center. For 40 minutes I explained the project. Budget estimates. Construction phases. Restoration techniques. When I finished, the room applauded. Not loudly, but sincerely. As people began filing out afterward, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the door. My Aunt Margaret. She looked smaller somehow. Older. I wanted to say something, she said quietly. I waited. I'm sorry. 2 words. No excuses. No explanations. Just the beginning of something fragile. I nodded once. Thank you. Later that afternoon I drove to the edge of town. To the 2 acres my grandmother had given me all those years ago. The oak tree still stood at the center of the property. Massive. Unmoved by decades of arguments about who owned the land beneath it. Marcus stepped out of the car beside me. So this is it. This is it. What are you going to build here? I looked across the field. The creek glimmered in the distance. I'm not sure yet. He smiled. Whatever it is, it'll last. I nodded. For years my family had defined me by what they believed I lacked. Dropout. Divorced. Barren. Failure. But none of those words had anything to do with the life I had actually built. And standing there beneath the oak tree I realized something important. You don't need permission from the people who tried to diminish you. You only need the courage to stop believing their version of the story. Because once you do, you can begin again. The Oak Ridge presentation ended with polite applause and the quiet shuffle of chairs. People gathered their coats, murmured to each other and filtered toward the exit. But the moment didn't end when the room emptied. In a town like Oak Ridge, moments never really end. They ripple outward. The next morning Marcus texted me a screenshot from the local newspaper's website. Historic mill restoration approved, Charleston architect leads project. Underneath the headline was a photo taken during the council meeting. Me standing beside the projection screen. Blueprints glowing behind me. I stared at the image for a moment before setting the phone down. 16 years earlier the same town believed I had dropped out of school and run away with a boyfriend. Now they were reading about a project I was leading. Not because I forced them to change their opinion. Because reality had quietly replaced the story they were told. Marcus called an hour later. Congratulations, he said. For what? For becoming Oak Ridge's most interesting piece of gossip. I laughed. High praise. You should see the comment section. I'm afraid to ask. Half the town is arguing about whether the Carters deserved what happened. And the other half? They're asking when construction starts on the mill. That made me smile. My uncle didn't call again. Not that month. Not the month after. Sometimes silence says more than confrontation ever could. Marcus had a theory about it. He doesn't know how to talk to you anymore, he said one evening while we reviewed site plans. What do you mean? He spent decades controlling the narrative. The moment he lost that control, he lost the language he used to communicate. I considered that. Maybe. Or maybe he's just embarrassed. That too. Either way, the silence didn't bother me. For the first time in my life, my uncle's approval, or lack of it, had no influence on my decisions. Late autumn arrived in Charleston with cool mornings and golden leaves drifting across sidewalks. On a quiet Saturday, I drove back to Blue Ridge Care Center. Grandma June had started physical therapy after her surgery. When I walked into the sunroom, she was slowly navigating the floor with a walker. Her face lit up when she saw me. Look at this, she said proudly. Impressive. I'll be dancing by Christmas. I doubted that, but I admired the optimism. We sat beside the window while afternoon sunlight warmed the room. She asked about the mill project, the courthouse renovation, the architecture firm. Then she asked a question I hadn't expected. Have you spoken to Daniel? I shook my head. No. She nodded thoughtfully. He called me last week. That surprised me. What did he say? He asked if you were happy. I blinked. That's unexpected. Grandma June smiled faintly. People change slowly, Ava. Sometimes it takes a very public lesson to begin that process. Construction on the mill began just after the new year. The building had stood abandoned for decades. Broken windows. Collapsed interior beams. Dust thick enough to erase footprints overnight. But beneath the decay, the structure was solid. Stone foundations. Massive timber supports. The kind of craftsmanship rarely seen in modern buildings. Standing inside the shell during the first construction meeting, I felt something close to awe. Marcus walked beside me inspecting the scaffolding. You ever notice something? He said. What? Restoration projects are basically redemption stories. How so? You take something people gave up on, and prove it still has value. I glanced around the cavernous interior. Sunlight streamed through empty window frames. Dust floated in the air like tiny sparks. That's a nice way of looking at it. He grinned. Architectural therapy. In February, my phone rang during lunch. Lila. I hesitated before answering. Hi. Hi. Her voice sounded steadier than the last time we spoke. How are things? I asked. Better, she said. Garrett and I are still in counseling. That's good. She paused. I wanted to tell you something. Okay. I visited Grandma June last week. That's nice. She told me stories about when you were little. I smiled slightly. There are probably many embarrassing ones. Actually, they were mostly about how stubborn you were. That sounds accurate. Another pause. I'm starting to understand something, she said quietly. What's that? How easy it is to hurt someone when you grow up thinking they deserve it. Her honesty surprised me. I'm glad you're thinking about that. I'm trying, she said. Spring arrived early that year. One afternoon, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Handwritten address. Oak Ridge return address. Inside was a short note. Ava. The Town Historical Society is hosting a ceremony next month to celebrate the mill restoration project. They asked if I would attend. I wanted to know if you'd be comfortable with that. Daniel. I read the message twice. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing I'd ever received. Marcus glanced over my shoulder. What's that? My uncle asking permission to attend a public event. Well, Marcus said, that's a plot twist. The ceremony took place in early May. Construction on the mill had progressed far enough that the building's transformation was visible. Fresh brickwork. Reinforced beams. New windows installed along the upper floor. A small crowd gathered outside beneath a temporary canopy. Local reporters. town council members, residents curious about the project. When I arrived, Eleanor Whitaker greeted me warmly. "You did remarkable work here," she said. "We're just getting started." Across the lawn I spotted familiar figures. My Aunt Margaret, Lila, and finally my Uncle Daniel standing slightly apart from them. For a moment neither of us moved. Then he walked toward me. "I wanted to congratulate you," he said. "Thank you." He looked older than I remembered. Not weaker. Just tired. "I was wrong," he said quietly. The words hung in the air. No excuses. No explanations. Just truth. I nodded once. "I know." Later that afternoon I stood inside the mill's main hall with Marcus. The ceremony had ended. Guests had left. Construction crews would return the next morning. Sunlight poured through tall windows onto the wooden floor. "You okay?" Marcus asked. "Yes." "You look thoughtful." "I was just realizing something." "What's that?" "For years I thought closure meant hearing an apology. And now I think closure is simply realizing you don't need one." Marcus considered that. Wise. Early summer brought warm evenings and long golden sunsets. One Saturday I drove back to the 2-acre property outside Oak Ridge. The oak trees still dominated the landscape. Marcus walked beside the creek inspecting the terrain. "So," he said, "any progress on deciding what to build?" "A few ideas." "Care to share?" I looked across the open field. "A small house," I said. "For you. For anyone who needs a quiet place to start over." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "That sounds suspiciously philosophical." "Architecture does that to people." By autumn the mill restoration was nearly complete. Brick walls cleaned. Wooden beams reinforced. Large windows filling the interior with light. The building that once symbolized decline now stood as something entirely different. At the opening ceremony the mayor gave a short speech. Then Eleanor Whitaker invited me to say a few words. I stepped to the microphone. Faces filled the room. Many familiar. Some from the wedding months earlier. But this time the atmosphere felt entirely different. Supportive. Curious. Respectful. "I believe buildings are like people," I said. "They carry the marks of their past, but that doesn't mean their future is limited by it." The audience listened quietly. "Sometimes the most meaningful work we do isn't building something new," I continued. "It's restoring something people thought was beyond repair." Applause filled the hall when I finished. That evening Marcus and I stood outside the mill watching the sunset paint the sky orange and violet. "You know," he said, "this whole story would make a great movie." I laughed. "Only if they changed the names." "Obviously." We stood in comfortable silence for a while. Then he asked the question everyone eventually asks after a long journey. "What's next?" I looked toward the mountains rising blue in the distance. "More work," I said. "And maybe building that house by the creek." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Sounds like a good plan." Driving back to Charleston that night I thought about everything that had happened over the past year. The wedding. The slideshow. The confrontation. The rebuilding. For a long time my family believed they had defined my story. Dropout. Divorced. Barren. Failure. But none of those words had anything to do with who I became. They were simply labels applied by people who needed someone else to feel smaller than them. The truth was much simpler. A life isn't measured by the worst things people say about you. It's measured by what you build after hearing them. And sometimes the most powerful moment in a person's life isn't the day they prove their critics wrong. It's the day they realize those critics were never qualified to judge them in the first place. The road stretched ahead beneath the fading sunlight. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't driving away from something. I was driving toward everything that came next.